This is So Fail, So Good, the podcast that changes the way we talk about failure from women who've lived through it and learned. Today on the show, we have Rebecca Kolls. She was a former contributor on Good Morning America. She was also the executive producer and host of Rebecca's Garden. Rebecca is now a director analyst for Gartner as a strategic advisor to major brands surrounding consumer trends. Talk about a powerhouse. This is a woman with a strong internal compass that I greatly admire. You'll probably be asking yourself at the end of this interview, what can't this woman do? Okay, on to the show. Rebecca Kolls, welcome. Hello.
Thank you. Hello. It's nice to be here.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
Very excited to have you today.
Thank you.
So we'll just jump right in, and we're going to start from the very beginning. What was your first job, first ever paycheck?
First ever paycheck came from a company called Dulgens, which is now a Best Buy, but it was home retail. I was the expert in the silver department, and we sold stainless and we sold sterling. So that was my first job at 16 years old that I actually got a paycheck. But actually, if we go back sooner than that, not legally, but I had my own little daycare when I must have been in about sixth grade. I started a daycare at this townhouse development, and it was called Mom's Day Off on Fridays. 50 cents an hour for each child.
Oh, my goodness.
In the community center, I got to color with kids and just babysit them.
Great name, Mom's Day Off.
Yeah.
And I know the listeners can't see me, but my eyes are just so wide. Sixth grade, wow.
Yeah.
So you had that work ethic in you and ideas flowing from a very early age, it sounds like.
I grew up in a large family, and we always had chores. We always had to work and do something. Mm-hmm. There was no such thing as idle time in my family. And as you'll learn through my history, I'm not good with idle time. And I look at retirement going, what am I going to do with myself? So as a result, I'm not retiring, by the way.
It just sounds boring. There's too many fun things to explore.
Right.
Well, so you grew up in Salt Lake City, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, big family, it sounds like. And did you then stay around there for college, or where did you go off for college, or for?
Yeah, so about eighth grade, my dad was transferred, and it was an interesting transfer because half the children were old enough to stay home in Salt Lake. Mm-hmm. The other half had to go with mom and dad. So our family was kind of fractured, which was really a bummer. But half of us packed up and moved to Kansas City. I grew up in Overland Park at that point, and then went on to the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk Jayhawk.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so your family, it splits up, isn't that? And you're saying that's because some of the kids were old enough they were all having their own lives.
Yeah, living on their own. There was one still in high school, but he was old enough that he would live with the other brothers and sisters, which ended up not to be a good thing. Imagine that.
Sure, being in high school and only having your older brothers and sisters.
Oh, yeah, it was heaven.
Sounds like a good deal he got there, or she.
Yeah,
or she. He. Okay, so you're at Kansas. You're away from home for the first time, and what do you study? What do you?
So I went to the university. I didn't know what I was going to study, but I had to keep taking these electives, right? Mm-hmm. And I had to take a science, and there was this meteorology class. Well, when I got to Kansas, we had tornado sirens going off. We had severe weather that was so cool. My dad and I would hop in the car and follow these storms and look for these storms. We'd get on top of the roof of the house watching for these impending tornadoes coming. Oh my gosh. And so I thought, well, I'm taking this class. I took that class and I absolutely devoured that class. I loved it. And I kept taking more and more electives that were connected to it. And eventually the professor came up to me, and this was interesting because there weren't any women in the meteorology program. And he came up to me and encouraged me to continue on with his classes. And it took me under his wing, really. And eventually I changed my major and I ended up with a degree in atmospheric science.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing that you were a storm chaser from college. I love that. It reminds me of that movie with Jodie Foster. Twister, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you are studying atmospheric science, and what do you think you're going to do when you graduate?
Well, so I think that I'm going to NASA, because why not?
Why
I mean,
not?
that would be the ultimate for somebody with a degree in weather. And what I learned very quickly is while I did really well in school and got great grades, I had to work hard for those grades. Whereas some of my counterpart students were just naturally like genius in this. And so it became much harder as I took more advanced classes. Now, to go to NASA, you don't go in with a BS degree. You need to really get an upper level education degree. So, I looked at masters, which we didn't have. A PhD, of course, would have been really the bomb to go. And for me, it was a couple of things. Number one, I didn't have the money. I paid my way through college, and so I would have to think about serious loans because this was now going to be an increase in the cost. And I just did not feel like I was smart enough, which I kick myself today because I was. And then finally, what really was the factor that said maybe this isn't for you, I started doing internships around with the National Storm Center in Kansas City. And it was all men. They were all super serious. Like back in the day, this was white shirts with, pocket protectors on. And I got stunted there because I needed more socialization. I needed something that was a little more conversational and more fun. And that sounds kind of awkward, but it just was too clinical for me. And I really got scared because I was like, now what am I going to do?
I mean, knowing your personality a bit now, I can definitely see where that would have been stifling and just not the right environment for you because you're kind of meant to be on stage and just such a good storyteller. So I can imagine that it wasn't the right fit. What led you to say, okay, maybe it's TV?
Well, my professor, remember the one that took me under his wing, I went into him deflated, like, oh my God, I'm going to have to do sales or something. And he said, there is a TV station in Topeka, Kansas. I want you to just stay put for a second. He goes into his office. He comes back. He gives me an address. He goes, I want you to drive out there and do an interview with them. And I was like, to do what? Like, this is me. To do what? Sales? He goes, no, they need a weekend weather person.
Sure.
Now, understand, I lived an hour and a half away from Topeka, Kansas. I wasn't going to take this job, but I was doing undergrad research and I needed, all the great grades, and I was going to do whatever my professor, wanted me to do so that I could be on his good side, right? So I took off in my little lime green Pinto. I drove to Topeka. They threw me in front of a green screen, which I had no idea what it was, and threw up a bunch of maps and said, just kind of talk us through this. And I would have loved to have seen that tape because everything was like being in front of a mirror. I kind of just made fun of it. And I had a good time. And I did explain everything like it scientifically should have been explained. And then I picked up my backpack and walked out. And as I was leaving, the news director said, hey, wait, come back here. We want to hire you. And I was like, no, you don't. And he's like, we'll hire you $25 a show.
Wow.
So understand, I had to drive an hour and a half to go to Topeka, Kansas to do the weather on TV for $25.
How did that feel? I mean, it was your first. I mean, it must be exciting to know that you're wanted and you did a good job and you nailed the interview. But what were you thinking? Were you like,
I was like,
I can't do that.
yeah, I was thinking, oh, that's a long commute. Yeah. And in Kansas, you can be under severe weather alerts all day long, and that's my job. So sometimes for that $25, I would spend 12 hours there. And I didn't have the money to spend the night there. And so it was grueling. But, here I am. I'm a kid. I'm thinking, I'll just do this. I mean, who knows where this might take me? And, of course, that was the beginning of my on-air career.
Oh, wow. Okay. That sounds like an adventure. So you take the adventure, and then what happens? Do you stay at that same station in Topeka?
No, I was there. I was there until I graduated. And at that point now, I am an official meteorologist. I am filling in for the main weather guy, and that's what I will call him. Typically, we call them chief meteorologists, those that are, accredited. He wasn't. So I'm filling in for him during the week, and there's severe weather. So for the first time, I get to break in and say, meteorologist. And the second I did that, the news director came running into the stage and said, no, you can't say that. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, it will make Tony look bad because he's not a meteorologist, so we don't want you to say that. And so, I'm looking around going, what? And then they had consultants come in and tried to tell me how to dress. And this wasn't, dressing for success. This was dressing for sex.
Yeah.
And that's when I knew, like, hashtag me too, I'm out of here.
Right.
And so I ended up quitting. And now I have nothing. I have nothing but a couple of tapes. I only worked there 6 months. And I have a couple of tapes. And I remember, like bemoaning the fact to my brother that now I don't, what am I going to do next? He's in Salt Lake. And he said, they've never had a woman meteorologist on the stations in Salt Lake City. Why don't you send a tape out here? In fact, I know, this guy is leaving.
Oh.
So I sent a tape going, okay, yeah, right. One tape. That's all I had. I send that tape out and I get a call and they're flying me out for a job interview. And I get there and I'm offered a job in Salt Lake City.
And so you've left behind what feels like icky. You want a new start. You're over it. And just an environment, a culture that was not exactly ready for women on air that are there to actually do a job versus maybe just be something to look at. Really quick, can you tell me a little bit about the experience being probably one of the only females in a group? And I mean, just during that time as well, and how you sort of got through that?
There were 5 of us at the time. So that's how rare it was. Salt Lake City was not a place even though I was born and raised there, I wasn't Mormon, and, my father was, I wasn't. And part of that time period was that women stayed home and basically took care of their husbands and raised kids. And by me taking the job of a man meant that somebody wasn't getting fed. And I got hate mail. Wow. And then I got promoted to the chief meteorologist position. And the hate mail got worse. And it was unbelievable. I wore suits. Back in the day, that's when the suits were really popular for women. I had some beautiful designer suits, but I was told I couldn't wear them because when I walked across the screen, you could see through my legs, and that wasn't cool. So that started. Then I was told that, oh my gosh, I hope you're not thinking about getting pregnant, because if you do, we've never had a pregnant lady on air, and they don't know what to do with themselves. Well, guess what? I get pregnant. And unfortunately, it was a high-risk pregnancy, so I had to leave my job anyway. But left the job, had the baby, and then another station in town, hired me back. So that's going on. My contract is up for renewal, and I really feel like I need a new start because I really don't want to raise my kids there, or my kid. And so I was shopping around, and I found that there was a job open in Minneapolis, and everybody told me, if you want to get anywhere, get to the Minneapolis market. It's a cool place to go. They forgot to tell me how cold it was.
Very cool.
But I came out here for a job interview right after the Halloween blizzard. I was pregnant again with my second child, by the way. I didn't tell them, but I had a great interview. They immediately offered me a job, and then I'd say, well, I need to tell you something, because I was afraid. I have been trained that you can't be pregnant on air. And I told them I'm pregnant. And I'll never forget, the news director, John Lansing, said, that's even better. When can you be here? Wow. And I just was like, what? And I came back. When I started, we had the Super Bowl here. We had the World Series here. And they were like, we want you to look fabulous on air. We will give you a clothing allowance. So, whatever. Wow. But we want to make this work for you. And I'll never forget, I was embraced in a community that loved women, that loved the fact I was pregnant. In fact, I was having contractions on the day that my daughter was born, or the night before. I was on air, literally having contractions. So it was a great place to come to.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm so glad that Minnesota was that feeling of home for you. And now you kind of make your way through the ranks, and you eventually get your own show. Tell me a little bit about that show.
Yeah, so part of my job responsibility in Minneapolis was to do gardening segments, because I started that in Salt Lake City, but it was contractual. It was part of what they expected. And so we decided, we had this pie-in-the-sky vision of doing a rooftop garden, thinking we'll just throw together some raised bed gardens, whatnot. It ended up costing, $500,000 to do it. We shut down Nicollet Avenue to, get cranes up there. and that became my set. That became my backyard. And it got national attention in Better Homes and Gardens, in architectural design, and the attention from the Hearst Corporation, who wanted to create a show and a magazine to go after Martha Stewart. So they reached out to me, and I was like, I'm working full time. I have 2 kids. I'm not interested.
Right.
They kept calling back, and they said, listen, let's just go to Mill Valley, California. Now, remember, it's January. Let's go to it's December. Let's go to Mill Valley on a weekend, and let's just shoot a pilot. And let's just see what happens. I'm like, Mill Valley in December?
Yep.
Goodbye. So off we go. We shoot this pilot, and then they take this pilot to this convention where all the news directors come together, and they try selling it. If you're lucky on a new show, you'll get about 72%. That's kind of the barometer of going and running with a show. We got 92% right out of the gate.
Wow.
And I was like, uh-oh.
I'm going to have to do the show.
And so now it's like, what do you do? So I did both for a while, and then eventually I had to leave TV because the weather, because it was just too much.
Too much. And that show is called Rebecca's Garden.
Rebecca's Garden.
And that show, so I mean, things are looking really good at this point. You've got Rebecca's Garden. It includes like a magazine companion piece you just mentioned. And then you also get a regular spot on Good Morning America.
They actually offered me a full-time position to do weather.
Okay.
And I was like, no, I don't want to raise my kids in New York. My kids are now into hockey. You know, hockey like ruled our life. And I just did not want to live there. And so we came to this idea that if I did not take on the full-time job, would you do a part-time job? Fill in for us until we find a full-time meteorologist. So I filled in for about a month. They found a full-time meteorologist, and then I was like the backup meteorologist, plus I was their lifestyle contributor. So every other week I was flying to New York City.
Wow.
And doing the garden show. But we all did it together. So we really were smart in how we managed time.
Wow. Okay, so you've got 2 kids. You are flying back and forth on weekends to New York.
No, not on weekends.
Oh,
during
just
the
week.
week.
During the week.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, and then you're still doing Rebecca's Garden, and you also decide to start consulting at this time too, for major gardening brands. Is that right?
Right. They need help launching new products, and they want, they need the pulse of the consumer. What can you help us with? Help us with messaging. In some cases, I helped endorse some of the products, but it was mainly, helping them launch new products, and that's where the money was actually. It was short contracts, but wow, you got paid a lot of money, and I like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially. You've got a lot going on. It sounds like your plate is very full, and you're seeing that the consulting is really paying the big bucks. So then what happens?
Well, so typically in syndicated shows, now this show was syndicated at 94% of the cities. Usually the lifespan, this was back then, the lifespan ran about 3 years guaranteed if you were good. 5 years was nice. I mean, that was really nice. So we knew we had probably 5 years. And then after the 5th year, we all started getting together going, this could be the last year. This might be the last year. And we did it for 12. So we extended, the expectations of a show. So we were doing this for 12 years. And what happened through the process is it was sold to NBC Universal, then Scripps Howard. And through the process, the show became diluted. It started losing its integrity. Money was becoming to be a problem. And so we were trying, they were mixing old parts with new parts. And that's when I said, you know what? This is not where I want to go because I don't feel good about this. And I quit in the 12th year.
Okay. So 12 years on the show.
Yeah.
And you decide to leave. Are you still doing some of that back and forth with Good Morning America, or?
No, so that eventually goes away because that was it made sense with the show and all that. But I was doing the subcontracting thing, so I really didn't care.
Yeah.
So that was good.
I'm making money. This is good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right, you leave that behind, and then now you've got just the subcontracting. And I'm saying just, of course, compared to your plate before. You're now more singularly focused, and then you decide you want to start your own magazine.
I decide, I've got all this experience. I've got this knowledge. I can do it.
Sure.
So, I started Seasons Right by Rebecca. Okay. And I did the magazine, I think, for 3 years, still did the subcontracting thing. And then this thing called the Great Recession
Yeah.
happened. And that's when within a year, all my subcontracting jobs, once the contract had expired, it was like, ooh, we
Yeah.
don't have the money anymore. And then when you think of consumers, the budgets,
Yeah.
they were trimming anywhere they could. And so I entered this idea of doing a magazine at a time where the stars were not aligned
Yeah.
at all. And I spent a lot of my own money trying to make it work, doing all the work myself, which was a mistake. And I did produce a beautiful magazine that was very informative. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, a woman from Vail stops me in Stillwater and says, "Hey, you're Rebecca, aren't you?" And she talked about this magazine she got. I've kept every issue because I use them still today.
Wow.
And it was a great part of my journey that I will always hold dear because it was really fulfilling.
And what do you remember, loving about the magazine experience and starting that, and what do you remember as challenging?
I loved the creativity part. I loved coming up with ideas, trying to create new trends. I'm not an excellent writer, so I would write it, and then I did hire an editor to clean it up, which she had to do a lot of. I didn't like the business part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not good at that. It's not something I love, but I had to do all that stuff. I did my own photography, which absolutely that's when I like fell into this peaceful serenity when I was out shooting, whatever it was. I really like detached from the world and got into myself and into my own head and really love that part.
We'll be right back after the break. Welcome back to So Fail, So Good. So it sounds like you're discovering things about yourself that maybe you didn't know before. And I think with a lot of entrepreneurs and these different ventures we try, we can find out what we love and what we don't love. And then you, of course, try to hire around it. At what point did you know and say, all right, I got to stop
This
doing
is
this,
it.
or it's not working?
Yeah.
Or do you remember
Yeah.
specifically?
Yeah. Well, I was using my own money
Mm-hmm.
to finance the magazine. And what I didn't take into account is I didn't take into account the number of years it would take to build success. And I went through a lot of money really fast. And now I am faced with, do I get a loan, a personal loan, or do I need to face the realization that maybe I can't do this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what was really hard, is facing the music that I can't do this. I want to do this. I love doing this, but I can't. I'm not good enough. And when I say good enough in all the different things I was doing. And I'll never forget when I had to pull the plug, I felt like I let everyone down, and that was the worst part of the whole journey. I even spent money to send out a note card that I was very transparent. I explained exactly what was going on, the financial cost behind it, and I remember ending it, if only money grew on trees. And the thing that was really cool, and I think the thing that stuck with me when I did that, is by being truthful and honest, not one of my subscribers, which I think I got up to I want to say I got up to 40,000, but not one subscriber asked for their money back. Not one subscriber had anything negative to say. And in fact, I got more mail, and of course it was mail, that they were like, "Oh, we're keeping our fingers crossed. We hope it works, and don't worry, just save the money, and if you can do it again, just keep me on your list." And man, I was so thankful for those people. But boy, it crushed me. It really crushed me.
Do you remember how it may have impacted your identity at that point too? Because you've sort of been, your past is just kind of success after success after success, and like you said, facing the music of, oh my, this isn't working for whatever reasons are surrounding it, but knowing that I'm going to have to stop. What did that do to your personal identity at that time?
Well, your ego is blown, because you have been so successful, and why didn't this work? And you take advice from people in hindsight that was dumb advice.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize now that the people that I talked to that I thought were my colleagues that would give me give me the right advice gave me the wrong advice because they wanted to protect their own territory.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want me to compete with their stuff. And that's what it was about, I believe.
Yeah.
Now I could be wrong about that, but I, because I did reach out and I said, who should I call? How can I make this? I want to contact one of the editors. Oh, don't contact the editor. Editor, I was a very good friend with.
Mm-hmm.
No, don't do that. Don't do that. And I really believe to this day that if I would have contacted any of the editors that I knew at the Hearst Corporation, any single one of them would have sat down with me and laid it out, would have wanted to help me,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't do that. And that was a mistake.
Yeah. And it's always so easy to see all of the things after, right? The looking back and having the time to reflect and learn and say, I would have done all these things differently.
Right.
And for you in those, I guess, final months before you decided, all right, this isn't going to work, you put that out there in such a truthful, awesome way. I mean, it kind of, I mean, it's really inspiring for me to hear because with my first failed business, I was so in my own head about it, and I just let it quietly die. I didn't want anybody to know. I mean, I didn't have subscribers like waiting to hear from me or anything, but it was a place where I felt, like you said, just really this disappointment. And so where do you think you got the courage to be so upfront with everybody and say, you know what, this is exactly what happened, and I wish it could have worked, but it didn't?
Yeah. Well, I was deflated for a long time. And I think, for whatever reason, and I was thinking about this and I was trying to figure out the one thing that I think is a strong character of mine is I've always been resilient. And that might be because I grew up in a family that was, I think, considered poor. We were able to do cool things on limited budgets. Things always didn't work for us, but we always were able to pick ourselves up. And my dad was always one that, he wasted no time on whiners, that you had to move on. And so I think for me, and I've always been this way, anything that hasn't worked, rather than dwelling on the failure, which I hate that word. And I can tell you why, but failure, failure means, to me, did you try your hardest? Did you lie? Did you cheat? Were you irresponsible? Were you lazy? And if you say no to those things, then it wasn't a failure. It was just the circumstances. And so anytime anything in my life that hasn't gone the direction I had hoped for, I always have to stand back and go, okay, first of all, did I do these things?
Right.
And if my heart was in it, then I have to really look at, okay, what could have I controlled? And in many cases you can't. And then I take what I've learned through those experiences and just try to carry that into my next stage of life, which I'm doing right now.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so awesome that you mentioned the word that you hate how it sounds. And that's actually, I mean, a huge part of why I'm doing this show is trying to dismantle the word failure and what it means and how it is such a personal thing. And I wish there was a different word, right? Because it means so many things and it means it to so many people. It can feel so differently. And it comes in all shapes and sizes. And when we think of the word, you have all these things you associate with it, right? But again, to each person and in that moment, the feeling is that it didn't measure up, or you let something down, or it just didn't work out the way you
or
expected.
maybe you weren't good enough. And there's always that. And I can say that honestly. I was good enough creatively. I was good enough as a photographer. I wasn't that great as a writer, but I took care of that. So that piece. But I didn't do the necessary financial homework to really see how viable this business really could have been or was going to be. And I say that with a caveat because, you always say, okay, so what did you learn? And maybe you should ask yourself these questions when you go into any adventure. And, I'm now looking at, buying another farm and creating a whole new, crazy thing. But so I automatically go back to, okay, let me do let me do the numbers. Let me do this. But the problem is, if the numbers don't add up, if you start looking at all the risks, then you're likely to step away and never
Right.
try. And look at all the most successful people in the world. They will tell you, if you're not willing to take a risk, you'll never be successful.
Yeah, no risk, no reward.
Exactly. And so I did learn a lot that will help educate me as I move forward in my life and whatever that means. But will it stop me at this point in my life? It might. But it gives me food for thought to really be considerate in a different sort of way.
Yeah, I completely get that. And I think failing is learning. And again, if we could pick another word, I would.
Yeah.
But if you're not out there trying, putting yourself in these situations that, really it's exposing yourself to feedback, critique, to anything by putting your own ideas into the world. And if they don't work out, you will learn something from that. That's a guarantee.
Right.
But if you don't do any of that stuff, if you just are on the sidelines in life and kind of watch it all pass by, yeah, the reward is I think it's just not there. And
you never reach your potential.
Right, exactly. So let's fast forward to let's see.
So I'm without a job and a magazine, and I've spent all my money. I'm screwed.
Yeah. What are your next steps?
So now I'm like, dang it, I'm going to have to look for a real job because right now I have no benefits, and I just I need income. And so I start looking around, and a friend of mine actually sends me a friend of mine from Gallup. From Gallup polls, sends me a job offer or a job for a small little company in Minneapolis called Iconoculture. They're looking for a strategist in the home and gardening space. And if you would have seen this list of expectations in order to apply, you would have probably been shocked because it was pages. But it was everything that they needed was check, 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 check. And so I thought, oh my God, this is perfect. So I applied for this job. 200 other people applied for the job. It was a 4-month process, and it got down to they did several interviews, and it got down to writing a paper and presenting, basically doing a presentation. And I knew that if I could get to the presentation stage, which was whittled down to 4 people, I knew I could win. Yeah. And I did.
Again, just meant to be on stage.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, so you've been there now for the last 10 or more years.
Yes. So Iconoculture is now Gartner. So we've been acquired by CEB, then Gartner. So now I'm an analyst with Gartner doing the same thing, which is studying consumer behavior. Okay. So it's very cool. I take back my experience was, tracking trends, if not creating trends. And now I not only do I track trends, but I do it through the lens of consumer behavior. So I help Fortune 1000 companies all over the world figure out how to get closer to consumers.
Very cool. And also you decide that's maybe not enough. Let's add something else to the plate. So you buy a store in Stillwater.
Yeah.
How did that come to be? What led you there?
So it was a friend of mine. His wife, his wife owned the store. She got cancer. She wanted to make this really cool, funky place, and she never had that chance. And he didn't know what to do with the store. So he reached out to my friend and said, Rebecca kind of, I think, has her pulse on this. Could she come in and look at the store and tell me what she thinks I should do? And I did that. And I walked in the store and literally looked around and in 5 seconds said, get rid of everything and start over. Because the store was old, it was dated, it smelled funny. It was like, still living. It was a farm store, so it was still living back in the 1950s. And so I tried to help this guy. I tried to give him advice, telling him what to do. And finally he said, I want to sell you the store. Why don't you buy the store from me? And, I said, no, I can't. I have another job. I've said that before. Anyway, I bought the store and we totally transformed it. We took a business that was literally, not making money, turned it into a hugely successful kind of destination place. I had 2 dogs. People came to see the dogs. We were making money, and it was going really well. I had a short-term lease, which is ultimately what killed me
Okay.
because I didn't know about it. And the landlord kind of had a different idea after a couple of years. He got remarried and wanted a different direction for the store. And so it became fighting for property I didn't own, investing all this time and making the decision, I making the decision whether or not I wanted to fulfill my contract or get out because it's hard to run a store when you have to close.
Yeah.
And so it was much more messy than that.
Sure.
I of course. But anyway, so I pretty much made the decision that I was going to pack up and leave while I could and not endure any more of kind of the behaviors that we had to face on a regular basis. And it was really sad. The store closed. It's still empty today. They're trying to sell it. We tried to buy it. It wouldn't sell at the time. He wouldn't sell it to us at the time. But what I miss about that store is, again, it was the creative process, shopping. I happened to be very good at buying product. I didn't know that, but my gut kind of led me to what I thought consumers would love. And I love that part of it. And again, it gets back to the business. I didn't love the business part, but we made it happen. I hired an accountant, and so sadly had to let it go.
And how many years did you run that store while also working for Gartner?
For 3 years.
3 years.
3.5 years. So,
what kind of store was it? Tell me about it. I
so
know where it started,
okay,
but what did you
yeah.
turn it
So
into?
it was a farm and feed store back in the day. So basically, we sold every product that a farmer might use, from feed to fertilization to minerals, vitamins, that kind of stuff. So that was like the warehouse part of the store. The front part was retail. And what they had up front was awful. I mean, it was old, it was dated, and it just didn't have the right kind of love that it needed for today's consumer. So what I did is left the farm as it is. That was a thriving business, so we kept that. And then the front part, I totally redesigned. Kept that organic farmish feel without it being country, and created an experience. So people came in. We had chalk on the sidewalk. We had bubbles. We had tasting stations. It was home. It was home products. It was, we had copper wind vanes that, would sell up to $800. We had wind chimes. So it was everything from $1,000 to little trinkets down to, $5. But just a really fun place with unique product, I think.
Yeah, and it was right on the main strip in
Right on Main
Stillwater.
Street, yeah.
And so over time, over those 3 years, I'm sure there were days that were really fun, and the days you buy the stuff and you watch it come in and you realize, it kind of reinforces that you've got that gift that sold through, or you knew that product was going to work. Do you remember some of the tougher days or the days that led up to where you knew, okay, this retail thing and all this drama with this, landlord, it's just not working? What were some of those experiences?
The hardest thing for me was the time that I had to invest in it. So I work full time for Gartner. That was running, easily 40, 50 hours a week. So when I was done with my job, I would run into Stillwater and, take a look, just catch up on anything I needed to do there. I was literally shopping at midnight for product. Every weekend, I was at the store. And I'll tell you, it was a blast when I first started, but it started getting old when I did take vacation, and I couldn't go anywhere without my phone being plugged in. And I'm the type of person, when I go on PTO, I'm off the grid. Don't call me. And I had to stay connected. So I was always being reminded of things that needed to be done, or did you pay this bill, or did you do this? When are we going to get that? And it was constant. So that was bothersome. But that could have been easily corrected. And we were looking to hire management because we got successful enough that we could hire, somebody to manage. And it's just, unfortunately, circumstances didn't even allow me to get that far.
Yeah. And when the store closed, and you had to say, okay, for, again, these circumstances surrounding it, we're going to have to close it down.
Yeah.
Do you remember, how you felt, whether it was that day after, just closing even that bank account for that, venture, like just
yeah.
the feelings
Well, it
were?
was profitable, so that was good. So
Good.
I
That's
ended
good.
up with money in my pocket. Yoo-hoo. But here's, I think that, I can sit and blame, the landlord all I want.
Mhm.
The bottom line is, and this is me in a nutshell, a handshake means a lot to me. And I trusted him and I trusted our agreement. And I did not have a lawyer look at a lease that we drew up together. It wasn't like a real
Right.
lease. And that's what ultimately hurt my longevity there.
Yeah.
And had I had the right guidance, they probably would have said, now listen, do you understand? That this means that, or this is only 5 years. You really should go longer because, it usually takes that long to just start building a business. And so there was that, but it was just the trust that I had in believing that the person I was doing business with, would live up to his words.
Right.
Yeah.
To keep that promise or the handshake
Yeah.
and again, it's hindsight where you look back and you say, well, I would have had that legal contract
Yeah.
drawn up, of course. Um,
You always have to remember. You always hear the adage. It's not personal. It's business.
right.
And I say that it's not of my character because I'm always like, I trust everybody, and that's a big mistake. But I really learned from that one that if I move forward, and which I'm in that process now, I will do it differently, and I will own, that space if I do a similar thing.
Hmm. Well, that leads to my next question.
As
Where is Rebecca Kolls now, and what are you dreaming big about?
So I still am, an analyst with Gartner. I'll probably be there until they kick me out. I love that job. It's remote. It is a very cerebral job, which is just steeped in research and evidence. And so it's kind of weird, but I think that's where my schooling comes back in. All the calculus, that kind of stuff comes into play. But I love studying consumers. However, the creative piece is missing. And so I have always, I've my philosophy for a career has always been to shingle for a career. And what I mean by that, and this has happened since my first job, look at the job you have as the foundation of who you are. But build shingles off of that. Take advantage of that job as a platform and build off of that. So if that foundation falls apart, you've got all these shingles you can jump on. And I've been shingling all my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so here I am with one job. It's the foundation. My next shingle is, okay, where will I go to next? Because I'm not going to be a good retired person. I mean, as much as I love to golf, I'm not going to do that every day. I want to do something that really keeps me active, keeps me focused, and really gives me something to live for in tomorrow. So I'm looking at I'd love to get a historic farm and turn it into a destination place that is similar, not a working farm in the types that we've seen here, but has animals.
Mm-hmm.
It's an educational place. Do classes that can range from making your own body butter to making pesto to sun drying your tomatoes or oven drying, which I'm doing right now at home.
Mm-hmm.
But classes like that, and maybe with a retail component around it, and maybe make it like an outdoor pizza place. So families come, there's something to do, there's something to eat, and there's something to learn.
I mean, sign me up.
Oh,
I want
geez.
to go.
Yeah,
Outdoor
I know.
pizza place.
Yeah.
And it sounds very magical.
Yeah. Well, I met with the owner this weekend, so
Oh.
and I look around with new eyes. So I don't know that I'll pull the trigger, but definitely something that I will consider, but I'll consider it with new thinking.
Sure. Well, I'm excited to see where that goes, and definitely will be a customer. And so my last question for you, Rebecca, hindsight is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing what you know now, where you are now, what advice would you give yourself looking back on those challenging moments, on those feelings of failure? What would you have told yourself?
I give myself credit for trying and dreaming big. And that's always been, something in my head as long as I can ever remember. And I remember my mother saying, people like us don't get to dream big. You'll never have that stuff. And those were fighting words for me. And I, in a weird way, I wanted to prove her wrong. And all of my brothers and sisters actually are very successful. And I really believe it was the resilience of picking ourselves up to keep going for what we wanted, because we didn't have a lot of the things that all our friends had. So looking back, maybe being a little more patient before pulling the trigger and really understanding what I was getting into. And I have to say that carefully, because at the same time, had I been patient, had I done all the homework, the question remains, would I have ever pulled the trigger? And I probably wouldn't have, because I would have seen the risks.
Yeah.
And I look at like the magazine as an example. That cost me a lot of money, but it was the most fulfilling time of my life as far as my profession and career than anything I've ever done. I loved it. I lost money, but I loved it. So would I take that back? Well, ask me when I'm like 80 and I need the money. Maybe. But so that's a tough question. Yeah. But I would just say, be patient and maybe spend time on homework, but dream big and go for it. Especially the younger you are, go for it.
Love it. I think that's very well said. And especially if there's not a bit of naivete, right? You might not do it. I think that's a really great point.
I was totally naive.
Yeah, I mean, so was I. And there is so much to be said about, like you said, crediting yourself for trying, because so many people have these ideas in their head and they don't go out there and do it. And you got to ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Did you notice that Rebecca said twice, I believe, that she hated the word failure? I hear you. There is something about that word that makes people so uncomfortable. And today's resource explains it as, quote, a word that sometimes gets stuck in our mental pathways. I remember when I was first telling my friends about this podcast idea and how I would be talking about my first business, Yogaloo, as a failure. And without missing a beat, all of them would jump in and say, oh, no, Laura, no, it wasn't a failure. There were so many things you learned. It really was a great idea, and, it still could work. They always had to cushion the blow to make me feel better, I guess. And it's really the word that brings that up. But we don't need to do that. Failure is messy and it can hurt. So as Rebecca suggested, maybe what if there was just a new word, a word that more accurately described what it means to fail? So I started thinking and doing some research on it. And I found this really great article that I'm excited to share. It proposed the idea of what if we traded out the word fail for growth? How much more accurate would that be? Thinking about Rebecca's story, for example, she was in constant pursuit of growth, and she still is. And when we're constantly pursuing growth, there's bound to be a few things during that growth where everything doesn't work out as planned. The article is from Inc. It's Time to Retire the Word Failure and Use This Word Instead by John Brandon. And in the article, John describes a new project he's taken up, which is gardening. And when his first attempt at building this massive garden doesn't work out, he came to this conclusion. Quote, a better word is growth when it comes to a setback on the way to success. I like that word much better. My seeds didn't grow, but I grew in my knowledge of gardening. I also learned that I may need to add more compost, that some of my plans for squash and strawberries may not work out. I had to grow before I could find success. I had to change my perspective, my level of knowledge, my understanding of the gardening process, and my time schedule. I had to accept that the failure was a teaching moment. Most importantly, I had to accept a need for growth in myself. So much juicy info in this one paragraph, and I couldn't agree more. The mission of this podcast and the community we're building is to change the way we talk about failure. So hopefully this sparks some conversation with your pals or colleagues, And we can start to feel less uncomfortable with the word itself and realize that failing is simply growing. Thank you so much for listening to So Fail, So Good. If you want to know more about the show or today's guest, visit sofailsogood.com. This is a Matriarch Digital Media production. Executive producer Twyla Dang. If you want to know more about Matriarch or other podcasts on the network, head to matriarchdm.com.